Welcome to another episode of Leadership Gems, a conversation today with Vicky Wallis. Leadership Gems is an interview series where we invite people interested in leadership, sharing their story about leadership, their insights, so that we can learn all the way through their careers and the ideas and activities that they have pursued. So rich conversation to have. My name is Bernd Vogel. I'm a professor in leadership at the Handy Center for Leadership here at Handy Business School. Hello, Vicky. Let me introduce Vicky Wallis to you. Vicky Wallis has her entire career done in the HR function, is currently the Chief People Officer at the Direct Line Group. Beforehand, she was with Santander UK, heading their human resources area. Vicky is also an alumni from the Handy Business School. Very glad that she was with our MA Leadership program, and we're very happy to have you here for our conversation within our Leadership Gems episode. Well, let me start with a look back. You know, when you look back at your career, when did you first think that what you're involved with feels like leadership or leading?
Yeah, and I think at the time you don't realise that's what you might be transitioning into. But when I reflect back, there was a period of time when, it's probably about 25 years ago, when I had been managing a team of HR professionals in a bank. It was RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. And all of a sudden, what we started to work on became more complex. And as a result of that, as I was managing this team of people, I had to take more of a step out strategic role in terms of driving the activities that we were doing. We were buying another bank, and all of a sudden my team became quite key in that process. So I had to step up and out and look more longer term, make a strategic plan about how we were going to act, how I was going to help them understand what was expected of them in that process, and also what was expected of the organisation as we went through that change. So it felt all of a sudden quite different. Did I realise at the time that was me stepping into leadership? Probably not. But I think when I look back, that's the point where I think, yes, I moved into a different phase in my career in terms of what I was doing and how I was working with the team and the people around me.
Did you set out when you started working to become engaged in leading and leadership? Was it a career goal or was it something on your mind?
No, I don't. I didn't personally. I think for me it was always about the work that I was doing and the impact that work was having. And it was I've always been in the HR or people space. That's been my whole career. Did I go into that thinking I was going to stay in that my whole career? No, I didn't. But actually, as it's evolved, I've stepped into leadership roles more and more. But it was never my ambition to be a leader in HR. It wasn't as clear as that.
At our Handy Center for Leadership, we often use the phrase leadership for what?
Yep.
And recently someone reminded me also leadership for whom,
yep.
As an extension of that. What is your purpose in engaging in leadership? What do you want to achieve with your involvement in leadership?
Yeah, I think for me it's about using your position to enable an organisation or the people in an organisation to really understand what they're here to do, what the aim of the organisation is, what their role is in that, and how you can galvanise them to understand the purpose, the drive for an organisation. And the role, for me in HR, it's also, my role has been, as a leader in that, for the purpose of it, has been to actually show an organisation what the value of people leadership actually is as well. So therefore, using my role to be a role model to others, to see that the role of the people environment is critical in an organisation. And I take that quite seriously as the purpose of my leadership is around bringing that awareness to organisations so that they understand the criticality of the people agenda. So that's how I've seen leadership in the purpose of my leadership now.
And who do you serve when you're engaging in leadership?
Yeah, I'm multifaceted, I would say. I think increasingly I've realised as I've taken on larger leadership roles that actually it's a 360 or a 720 in terms of who you're to whom you're serving. It's my boss, it's my colleagues, it's my team, it's our stakeholders externally, our shareholders, it's my family. There's so many different people I'm leading for, that it's more complex than I think I ever really realised. And as I take on more senior roles, you suddenly realise your influence as a leader is much wider, and there are more stakeholders than you naturally think there are. So I would naturally have thought it's just my team and the wider function. It is much bigger than that in terms of the responsibility.
And when we think about what you'd like to achieve, what role do global or local societal issue play for the business, but also for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a significant part of the role of a leader now, I think, in terms of whether that be environmental factors or probably more pronounced for me at the moment is the social factors. I think that the COVID years brought that into sharp relief for organisations, and from a people perspective, the social care that we required to do during those 2 years for colleagues in the organisation was huge, in a way that organisations had not really had to ever before, stepping into people's lives in a very different way. Coming out of that, we've now moved into a cost of living crisis, and therefore the organisation, because of the size of the organisation we are, has a responsibility to not only our colleagues but the environments within which we operate. So as a leader in that context, I have a duty of care to be aware of that and work out with my colleagues how we navigate it.
And how do you make that practically work? And it's a challenge. There's no surprise, a balancing act.
Exactly.
And how does it show? So how could you address that in recent months or years?
So I think one of the key things is to engage in conversations, really sort of robust conversations with all those stakeholders. So whether it be with the board of the business in terms of helping them to understand what we might choose to do about a cost of living decision, it's then helping them to see why we might make a decision that will cost us X amount of money, but we believe socially it's a responsible thing to do. And then you engage with your colleagues through whether it be, we don't have a union, we have an employee representative body, but you engage with them to understand their perspective and then try and make sure you bring the perspectives together as closely as you can. They're not necessarily always going to match, but I do think there's something about having good ongoing conversations so people understand. And you build trust through doing that as well. So people understand that you do listen, you do try and act, you bring them on the journey with you, so that when you make a decision, they're not feeling like they haven't had that whole conversation with you. So that's the balancing act. It's those conversations with all those parties to make sure they understand when you've got to a decision point, how did you get here and why did you get here? And yes, we can align behind that. Doesn't always work.
No, obviously, and like you said, it's a balancing act. If I may, I got curious about how's you're in the in my lay person terms, right? In the consumer insurance industry, right? If you look at your industry, and we know the debate around United Nations Developmental Goals, right? About ESGs, and how do you think is in your industry? They are positioned? Are they on a good track, right track? If we would know. So what do you think?
Yeah, and I think that comes down to each individual organisation and their approach to it. So every organisation is setting itself carbon targets, and all slowly publishing those to the external world. And within each organisation, there'll be activities going on that are helping to drive that, whether that be through direct use of carbon or third parties, sort of through supply chain, which often for a lot of organisations is the bigger part of it than actually their own. And we are in exactly the same boat. As an insurance company, we have direct usage and then we have influence over third parties. We as an organisation are we have in our purpose statement that we are a force for good, and actually it's a really easy throwaway thing to potentially put in your purpose statement, but we absolutely drive that in relation to, so first of all, going just back to COVID for a second, we did a huge amount for the communities that we operate within, but also for our customers around helping them manage through the COVID period. And similarly, from an ESG perspective, we are absolutely committed to driving, first of all, recognising and driving the use of electric vehicles. How can we really engage with that in relation to the provision of insurance for it, but also the education of people around how to use electric vehicles, because there's a lot of confusion about and the worry about electric vehicles that we want to educate people around. So although we may end up insuring it for an individual, we may not. It's about actually what's our role in educating. The way that we actually do a lot of our own repair, we have our own repair network, but actually the way we have these massive gas ovens that dry paint back onto cars once they've been repaired. How do we remedy that to make sure that we're thinking about making that sustainable? So every part of our thinking is around improving those. So it's not just we're making a statement to the market because we think everybody needs to. It's genuine driving for sustainable change and seeing our role as being very important in educating as well.
No, that's really interesting. It also shows, the breadth of business that you're in, right? Yeah. We look often as the insurance and the interface, but this looks like a production in the background, right? Which most people don't have in mind when you think about the direct line group or comparable insurers. It's quite a hands-on business as much as a high-tech business. So fascinating. Going back to your leadership impact or success, how do you personally evaluate your impact or success?
Yeah, I think so. When I first started in this particular role, I set out a sort of strategy. Took a little bit of time to get to understand the sort of the whys and wherefores of the organisation, and then what had already been done and the foundations already built. And then it's okay, let's look at what we think the next 3 years, as much as we can predict it, are going to look like for us, and what's the people agenda that we need to be driving. So I published working with my colleagues both in the function and actually within the business. What are the key things that are going to enable us to deliver our business strategy? My personal belief is a people strategy has to align with the business strategy. It can't sit alongside. And then we set ourselves some goals each year against those pillars that we've defined. So we've got a pillar around the shape of the organisation, one around the culture, and one around the skills. So I can measure the impact the function is having and my direction of the function on the execution of those pieces. Additionally, there are some more subtle things, which might be the influence that I have with my colleagues. And how do I measure that? It may be the type of conversations they draw me into, the advice they might seek, the expertise they might draw on, the CEO that I work for, how she and I interact with each other, the sort of value that I perceive I'm adding to those conversations with her, with the board. So you can, some of them are very obvious to measure, and others are much more subtle. But I can set myself some very clear KPIs, and then there are some sort of much more subtle ones. So also my own leadership development, and observing how, at the beginning of a year I might set myself some things that I want to step into more, stretch myself on more, and as you go through the year, how am I tracking against that? And sometimes I've tracked better than other times in terms of the prioritisation of it. But I think there are ways to track your performance as long as you've got some very clear deliverables that you're expecting of yourself, whether that be personal development or business deliverables.
No, that's fascinating, and obviously we fare sometimes better, and sometimes, and also in between there's a lot of change going on, so that we need relook and revisit what we're up to, right? What we're striving for. Now, at the Henley Center for Leadership, we try to stretch a bit what leadership really is. So one of the questions that we're interested in, so who do you do leadership with, and when do you know to step aside and make space for others to engage in leading? How do you do that?
Yeah, and this is a particularly interesting topic for me because I did my dissertation whilst I was here on followership, and actually learnt a lot about the subtleties of leadership and followership in some of the study that I did. And actually I think what I've realised is that you are a leader and a follower in a given conversation. So I can be in a given conversation with my boss, and at various times I'm stepping in and leading that conversation or the discussion we're having. And then at other points I will step back out and I'll be the follower again. And I don't think that a lot of people realise that that is actually going on in every conversation. So yes, I lead my function as the leader. You know, I've got the title and I'm the chief people officer and all that. But actually, there are plenty of times when I step out of leadership with my team or with wider groups in the function where they are absolutely leading and I am following them because they are either more expert or they have a really strong view or opinion or insight that I believe I need to step back and listen to this and be led by it. And then there's an obvious time where I have to step in and lead again. So I think it's a fabulous nuance, and I actually think the ability to know when to step in and step out and feel comfortable in that is fascinating, actually. And it makes me reflect on where there is the play of ego in those conversations, because some people don't like to step out of the leadership position because they feel it's a sign of weakness, whereas actually I personally believe it's a sign of strength and comfort within your own skin. But sometimes you feel you should be the leader, or because you are the technical expert, or you have that hat that you wear. So I think you gravitate towards leadership and followership with all sorts of groups of people at different times. So I don't think it's not a hierarchical thing at all.
Mm-hmm. You opened a bit the door how you engage with your boss, right?
Yep.
Yep. And I opened that door. You shouldn't have opened that for me. I'm getting curious. So how do you engage with your boss? How do you influence? You're working with the CEO and you've been previously in other organizations. So how can we see that if we get a sneak view into that? How does it work?
Yeah, it's very much a building of a relationship, I believe, where there is a trust that gets built. And I do think there's something in that leadership followership dynamic where trust is at the heart of it, mm-hmm. in terms of feeling that both parties are comfortable with that stepping in and out of that role. And is there an explicit contract that you're going to do that? Probably not, but I think there's something that builds over a period of time in terms of recognition of the skill sets that you each bring to the party, so that you are more equal players than your titles may dictate. Mm-hmm. Because, as when I work with Penny, who's the CEO, Penny is absolutely the leader of the organisation, but she recognises that I bring a skill set that she doesn't have the expertise in. And therefore, she will step away and seek my leadership counsel, and will let me lead in a conversation and she will follow. And then, as I said, it flips back to her being the leader again. So in a given conversation, I do think that the trust piece is key. Mm-hmm. The trust, and there's some proof points that you need to show as well, that you are able to take the leadership role and they can follow you. But they themselves have to work through, I think personally, how they let that happen. Because it's a dynamic with me as the individual. I have to feel comfortable stepping in and leading and not feeling like I'm treading on her toes. But also she needs to be comfortable that I'm stepping in. So there is a lot of your own, as I say, it's a bit of ego there. There's your own understanding of yourself and your comfort with sitting in different seats in a conversation, I think. And I've fortunately worked with leaders who find that quite comfortable and work very well in that dynamic. But I don't think that's always the case.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I think it's actually most of the time reality that this happens, yeah. and the hierarchical question is often not the reality.
Yeah.
It happens, right?
Yeah.
We know that, but often it's more, that more dynamic actually engagement, mutually fascinating. If you look at your role or the business, what are the leadership challenges that keep you awake at night? And I hope you have a very good sleep, but what is at your mind really in terms of big questions that you have?
So I suppose one of the big ones at the moment is the pace of execution that's required in our organisation, but I think I see it in other organisations at the moment. There's a relentless pace required to make the changes at the speed that you need to retain relevance in your sector. And actually that pace it therefore means that you have to be super smart at prioritising. And that means that some things that may have been sacred in the past are going to get pushed down the pecking order. So that means some really difficult conversations in terms of that prioritisation. But if you're going to go after pace, you've got to be super focused. And organisations, and ours just as much as others, can easily get distracted by a new shiny thing. And the new shiny thing might be the right thing to go after, but you've got to then bring it into the debate and the conversation to say, in our prioritisation stack, if we want to keep this pace going to execute and deliver what we've committed to, we either get distracted by that and something else falls out, or we don't get distracted by it. But I do think that organisations try to do too much at the same time, and we do. And actually, when you look at it on paper, you can see why you need to be trying to do all of it. But actually, sequencing work really effectively is a big part of keeping that pace going, and that's not easy. So if I wake up at night, it's that. How are we going to get through all of this in the pace that we need to, and how are we going to prioritise what we need to do first?
I hear often related to what you're saying that the work, particularly for senior managers, gets more dense. It's just more pressed. And how are you able to step out and not being overwhelmed by that? Well, if you are,
Yeah, no, and I think the other problem is that leaders in organisations don't allow themselves headspace time to step out and think. So you get caught up in the day-to-day, the diary's mad, in hybrid working you could be on Zoom calls all day, and you just get caught in that hamster wheel of execution without actually stepping out and saying, could we be doing this in a better way? Could we prioritise in a different way? So I think when I manage to do that, stepping out and taking some time to think, then I actually believe that I can get to a better result quicker. But it can feel, unless you allow that time, which sometimes I don't, you then can get caught up in it. It can become overwhelming. You need that space to allow your brain to start to work out, and it will work out how to break down some of the stuff that's going on and perhaps park some of it or reprioritise it. But I think that overwhelming nature, it's a real increasing pressure point in organisations because of the pace, because of the priorities, and the amount of different things that people are being expected to do. I do think, ironically, stepping out and taking time to think is the key to it, but it almost feels like it's the most ludicrous thing to do, is to take the time out because you're just too busy. Yeah. So there's a discipline, I think, that has to come with it as well.
Yeah. It's a bit like a guilty pleasure, right?
Yeah,
but it actually pays off. But we don't find often the time to step out and like a pit stop, right? Where which we see.
I used to call it in my diary. I asked my PA to put it in, and I have a slot in my diary called Project Silver. If you give it a project name, often it gets ignored. So actually, Project Silver has at various times in my career been my thinking time. But you do need to plan for your thinking time, otherwise it just doesn't happen.
No, people know that.
Yeah, no, I've told them all. I have to change the project name.
So you mentioned a bit the hybrid work. How do you lead practically in this hybrid new world of work, digital way? What are your learnings there? So what do you do?
Well, it's interesting because I think if you are what I would class as a more evolved leader, I don't actually think the hybrid working, the digitization, the new agile models I don't think it necessarily means that your leadership is different. I think there are some management practices that become different in those contexts, but if you're used to good communication, empowering, having clarity of strategy, putting a clear plan together, engaging people in the process of how we're going to execute, I think all those things play to just a really good foundation of leadership, whether it be a digital environment, whether it be a hybrid environment. I don't think it matters. I remember once going to a program where we sort of were asked what we thought the leadership attributes for an agile environment should be, as opposed to a a more traditional environment. And I said, I don't actually think it should be any different. They are good core skills of advanced or more sophisticated leadership that I think will hold the test of time for any context. But some of the management practices, yes, you need to work out in your hybrid working. You've got some people in the office, you've got some people at home. How are you going to make them feel connected? Is that a leadership thing? Possibly, because you need to think about communication, but is it probably more of a management thing, really? So yes, I don't think it's fundamentally that different. It just requires you to be a sophisticated leader.
In your senior group, if I may ask, are you operating in a hybrid world, or have you been going to the headquarters? How do you operate?
Yeah, we are. So it's funny actually. Most of the organisation is in a pretty much hybrid. So we made a very clear decision that we were going to let each team work out their cadence themselves. We were not going to dictate from the centre. So we have some teams that may be coming in a week every month, and they come in every day, and then they go off and they work remotely for the rest of that. If people want to come into the office, they can, as long as there's availability. And there are other teams that are coming in and they have their touchdown day every week on a Tuesday. And they may come in more often than that. As a leadership population, we're probably coming in a little bit more than that, but we're not requiring that everybody else mirrors that. And so far, it's working pretty well. We're 6 months into this. I keep describing is it's a big experiment. So we're 6 months into it. We're getting into a good groove. Our colleagues really like the way it's working. We're still getting how we make connection work meaningfully. But as a leadership population, we're probably in maybe 2, max 3 days a week. And that's more to do with things that we're choosing to do and get involved in than requiring everybody else to come in and mirror that. So, it's working quite well, but definitely still learnings for us as we go through it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, because a lot of senior teams, trying to exactly question role modeling, right?
Yeah.
You want role modeling, but actually here you don't, right? Find different ways. So that's a bit of delicate balance to be found. If I may, one of the things that we're interested is what we call when leadership has gone wrong. If you look back into your career and say, oh God, if I could just undo one thing, in my roles, what would that be?
So I think one of the things that sticks in my mind, and it's still something that I struggle with, is perhaps making decisions quickly enough about people that aren't right. So, if you've got a member of your team or a wider team that actually isn't functioning quite well, knowing when enough's enough in terms of you may have tried, you may have coached, you may have tried to develop that individual, but actually maybe there is a point where you've just got to have that honest conversation and say, it's probably time for us to have a conversation about whether this role is going to work for you. And sometimes I've sat on that too long. And you realise then that not only isn't that great for the individual really, because they're feeling that pressure for a bit longer, you're not getting to deliver and execute what you might need to as a function overall. And actually other people are observing that as well. They're observing that you're allowing that to linger longer than it should do. So I think that would be one. The other thing would be perhaps similar but slightly different angle is just bad hiring decisions, where you've hired somebody that you think, on paper and in the interviews was really good, and then actually when they arrive, they can't, I've had not very many instances, but instance where somebody was actually quite toxic, and you've then got to know that you've got to move on that fast. Because again, that person's influence can be quite wide-reaching, and also doesn't reflect very well on you as a leader if you don't address it. So those would probably be 2 of many things that I need to learn, but 2 things that stick out for me.
Hiring, thank you for sharing that, because I think, we have the myth that hiring always works, right? And no one wants to admit that. It just can go wrong, right? And then again, it's, how much do you invest? And it's not about the person. Right? It's often the fit question, and so not many admit, because it just looks bad, right? But it's happening. And it's then how to deal with that also personally, that's fascinating. if you think about your organization overall, you know, the leadership capability that it needs, right?
Yeah.
You know, going forward, what would be the 2-3 things that you have in mind to say that's really a capability that we should have as an organization in terms of leadership?
Yeah, and I think probably one of them would be the prioritization piece that I talked about earlier, is that ability to park your own agenda and elevate up to the enterprise agenda. And so therefore, your number one priority may become the number 5 priority because somebody else's number one priority is more. And that requires a little bit of maturity in terms of, as a leader, to be able to step back and say, okay, I see, for the greater good, my priority is going to move down the stack and maybe it will come up next time. So that prioritization capability and the mindset that comes with it, I think, is key. And we've been working on that for the last year in the organisation, and she's getting better and better. Because it may well also be that you have to give some of your resources to somebody else in order for them to make sure they execute, and that is going to slow you down. So that's quite a big give. The other thing is probably something around raising the bar on our expectations of performance. As an organisation, we have a really lovely culture. It's very warm, it's very engaging, it's very, felt very welcoming. Sometimes we overplay that warmth to the point that we don't want to have the difficult conversations with people if their performance isn't at the level that it should be. And therefore we're probably not evolving and driving performance at the level we should. So for me, that would be another one. And it's a conversation we've been openly having across the organisation, is we need to raise the bar. We need to, because then that stretches everybody if we raise the bar and we give people the opportunity to grow and develop and they see that they've got challenge. So those would probably be the prioritisation and the raising of the bar are two hot subjects for us in terms of really driving that leadership capability.
If you think about it, on the last one, it's really interesting. Where does raising the bar start? Is that in the senior group? Is that in the senior to manager? Is that in the first line? It's always the other one that need to raise the bar. So where does it start?
No, it starts at the top. It absolutely does, because I think, we've done some work as an executive committee in the last year about our own development as a team, our own openness to being developed, and seeing that we still have a huge amount to learn as a leadership population, and actually raising the bar ourselves on what we're expecting of ourselves as a team. Then we sort of cascaded it down to our direct report population, that enterprise leadership population. What are we expecting of them? And likewise, what are they expecting of us? So we created a 2-way contract with that population around, this is a 2-way gig. We are expecting this of you, but what do you need from us to enable that to happen? And we're raising the bar on what we expect of you, but you need to raise the bar on what you want from us. So it happens both ways, but I think it has to start from the top. And then you slowly work down the organisation in terms of creating that expectation and making sure you're living it. So it's a cultural shift. And it'll take a bit of time, but I think we've started that process.
And that brings us to one of the last few questions. So how do you develop leadership yourself? How have you evolved in your capability to lead? What are the things that you do?
Yeah. So what do? I think there was one point where I realised that I was, quite rightly, I surrounded myself with the same people every day. My influence was coming from the same people every day. I would have meetings with the same people, and therefore you think, where am I getting some wider stimulation? So trying, therefore, to reach into the organisation at different levels to get reverse mentors or just sort of coffee conversations with groups of people that really help you to understand what's really going on in the organisation, and then also outside. So I used to find it really hard to find time to read articles, to understand other perspectives. So on my Instagram account, for example, I will actually put it into my Instagram feed people that I wouldn't naturally follow because I don't necessarily agree with what they agree with or they represent. I won't give you any details, but actually by following them, I'm actually broadening my mind to understand that difference, because I think you can find yourself in a real silo if you're not careful as a leader, and then you're reaffirming every day because you're with the same people every day. So you need to find those ways, which I try to do more of. Obviously, I came here to do my studies, which I absolutely loved, to sort of broaden my mind about leadership, to understand different leadership concepts and sort of unpick them and put them back together again, but also was amongst a number of other people who had a different perspective. And I just think it's really important to keep that breadth of influence, because it broadens your mind when you're in conversations as you're leading and making decisions.
That's fascinating to hear, because often we hear that, some say it's getting lonely at the top, and I always called it a choice, right? Yeah. So you have discretion about who you talk to, but it's also kind of like an easy option and breaking out and getting diverse opinions. We always end with one question, and that is, what is the leadership myth that really gets on your nerves? And if you just could eradicate that we all forget about that, what would that be?
What would that be? So I think there is this preconception that leadership comes when you're older in age, and that you're a leader when you get into a certain stage in your career. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think leadership happens and leadership capability develops at all stages in people's career. Hence the fact that I talk about the followership and leadership piece happening in parallel. So my myth would be that you've got to have grey hairs to be a leader, and I don't believe that's true.
Well, that's hope for someone, So, but thank you very much, Vicky, for your time and sharing your thoughts and ideas. It has been a huge privilege.
Oh, it's been great fun. Thanks very much.
Thank you.